My bill, H.R. 3402, would amend the Exchange Act to require that institutional investment managers file an annual report showing how they voted and their alignment and consideration of proxy advisor recommendations. It would also require that institutional investment managers with over $100 billion in assets under management be required to clarify that shareholders are not obliged to vote every item and to conduct an economic analysis that a vote is in the investor's best economic interest. Mr. Copland, can you please explain the relationship between institutional investment managers and proxy advisory firms? In other words, why do institutional investment managers hire proxy advisory firms to start with?
Well, because it's an extremely complicated thing to vote on all these proxy ballots. I mean, Comptroller Lander talked about they have 10,000 or some odd investments. That's true for a lot of these institutional investors. And they don't really get a competitive advantage. It doesn't help their investment return to be a better voter. So a really large family of companies, the Vanguards, the BlackRocks of the world, they have teams on this. Smaller institutional investors don't, as a general rule, or at least a lot of them don't, and so they need help to execute this. So there is an economic rationale there. They've also been prodded that way, as was discussed earlier, by both DOL rulemaking in the ERISA context as well as by the SEC in 2003, which sort of created this demand by for a while there at least, giving a safe harbor to rely on this investment advice.
Okay. Can you explain what is robo-voting and why is it used by institutional managers?
Yeah, robo-voting is basically just a catchphrase to discuss we're going to basically effectively outsource our voting to the proxy advisor. And we commissioned a study by Professor Paul Rose in 2021 that looked at this, and we found a significant percentage of the market that was doing this, which is why when we studied ISS in 2012, we saw that for these precatory shareholder proposals, about 15% of the voting total was de facto controlled by ISS.
Okay, so instead of just taking advice from the proxy advisory firm, they're just handing their vote over to them.
Right, they're not making an independent assessment.
Okay. Could robo-voting harm the clients of institutional investment managers? Could it harm their overall returns?
It could. The complication with this question is that for the individual firm, the answer is probably not, because you're a small percentage of the vote. You're not likely to have an outcome determinative vote on any of these questions. In the aggregate, I think it harms it, and part of what it's doing there is we're basically creating this Rockville, Maryland-based business owned by the German stock market,
right,
is effectively driving 15% of the vote for all the publicly traded companies. I mean, that's huge.
That is huge. Why would a disclosure requirement for large institutional investment managers concerning whether they have engaged in robo-voting be useful?
I think it's useful because it enables individuals and institutions that put their money with those firms to know that that's happening, right? And it could create some pushback. It's a softer form approach than totally banning this sort of thing, and there's some bills out there that are floated on that as well. I think disclosure is a good disinfectant in general, and I think it's a relatively soft touch approach, but one I think would be quite useful.
So you talked about 15% being from a German-owned organization, right? Is that theoretically them bringing European ideas and interest and standards into the American marketplace instead of these investment managers making their own votes and decisions?
Well, it certainly could be. That's the risk. And there's conflicts of interest in all directions for the way ISS and to some degree Glass Lewis, the other big player, operate as well. I mean, there was an article in the Free Press just recently that NVIDIA has a larger market capitalization than the entire German stock market. Wow. And yet the German stock market owns the proxy advisor that controls 15% of the vote here.
Wow, that's amazing. Last question, do you have any other ideas for regulatory reforms that could reduce the influence of proxy advisory firms without imposing excessive cost on the institutional investment managers or stockholders?
We have a lot. The time's limited to go through them all, but I reference in my written testimony a paper I co-authored with David Larker and Brian Tayan at Stanford in 2018 that went through this as the SEC was looking at this, and they did a rulemaking in 2020. And then it was partially rescinded with the administration change, and they've been in court, and 3 different circuits have been opining on it, so it's kind of a mess, but which is why it'd be good for this body to act.
Okay, well, thank you. I yield back.